The story of the MV Wilhelm Gustloff begins not with war, but with luxury. Launched in 1937, she was a beautiful white cruise ship. She was built for the German Labour Front's Strength Through Joy program. The ship was designed to offer affordable holidays to German workers. It was a symbol of the Third Reich's promise of a better life. The Wilhelm Gustloff was a modern marvel of its time. It had comfortable cabins, spacious decks, and even a swimming pool. For 2 years, it sailed the seas, a floating paradise for ordinary people. It represented an illusion of peace and prosperity in a nation preparing for conflict. This peaceful purpose, however, was short-lived. When World War II began in 1939, the ship's role changed dramatically. The gleaming white vessel was painted a drab naval grey. The decks that once hosted sunbathing tourists were repurposed for military use. First, the Wilhelm Gustloff served as a hospital ship, a floating sanctuary meant to care for wounded soldiers. Later, it was docked in the port of Gdynia, then called Gotenhafen, in occupied Poland. There, it became a floating barracks for German U-boat trainees. The ship of dreams had been fully converted into a tool of war, waiting silently in the cold Baltic port for its final tragic chapter. The transformation from a luxury liner to a military vessel was complete. The swimming pool was drained and covered to make space for bunks. The elegant dining halls were turned into mess halls for naval personnel. The ship, once a beacon of leisure, now mirrored the grim reality of a world at war. Its original identity was stripped away, layer by layer, replaced by the stark functionality required by the German war machine. This change foreshadowed the immense human tragedy that would soon unfold upon its decks, a stark contrast to the joyful voyages of its early years. For over 4 years, the Wilhelm Gustloff remained in port, a silent witness to the escalating conflict. Its role as a barracks meant it was a stationary landmark in the occupied city. The naval trainees who lived aboard her learned the deadly arts of submarine warfare. They were unaware that the ship itself would become the site of one of history's greatest maritime disasters. The vessel that was meant to bring joy and relaxation was now deeply embedded in the mechanics of war. Its final journey would not be a cruise, but a desperate flight from the advancing front lines of a losing war. By January 1945, the war on the Eastern Front was collapsing for Germany. The Soviet Red Army was advancing rapidly across Prussia. This created a massive panic among German civilians and military personnel. They were trapped in the path of the relentless Soviet offensive. Fearing the brutal retribution of the advancing forces, millions sought to escape westward. This led to a massive sea evacuation named Operation Hannibal. It was one of the largest evacuations by sea in history. The goal was to rescue as many Germans as possible from the encircled regions, transporting them across the treacherous Baltic Sea to safer parts of Germany. The Wilhelm Gustloff was called into service for this desperate mission. The ship, designed to carry just under 1,900 people, including crew, was swarmed by a sea of terrified refugees. Official records listed around 6,000 people on board for its final voyage, but the reality was far worse. Thousands more scrambled aboard in the chaos, unregistered and desperate. The final count is believed to be over 10,000 souls. The passengers were a mix of people. There were wounded soldiers, naval personnel, and Nazi officials, but the vast majority were civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly, all fleeing for their lives. The ship was dangerously overcrowded. People filled every available space. They crammed into cabins, hallways, and even the empty swimming pool. The decks were packed with shivering, frightened families. There were not enough lifeboats or life jackets for even half the people on board. Safety protocols were completely ignored in the frantic rush to escape. The ship was a floating city of fear and desperation. Each person carried the heavy weight of what they had left behind and the terrifying uncertainty of what lay ahead. The sheer number of people made the vessel slow and difficult to maneuver. The journey began on January 30th, 1945, into a bitterly cold Baltic Sea. The temperature was well below freezing, and ice floes dotted the dark water. The Wilhelm Gustloff was part of a small convoy, but it soon became separated from its escorts. The ship was not marked as a hospital ship, as it was armed with anti-aircraft guns and carried military personnel. This made it a legitimate military target under the rules of war. It sailed slowly through the dark, icy waters, a beacon of light in the night, carrying its precious, fragile cargo of human life toward what they hoped was safety. As the Wilhelm Gustloff sailed through the frigid darkness, it was being watched. A Soviet submarine, the S-13, commanded by Captain Alexander Marinesko, had spotted the large, slow-moving ship. Marinesko saw the Gustloff not as a vessel filled with refugees, but as a German military transport. It was a prime target. Shortly after 9 p.m., the S-13 fired a salvo of 3 torpedoes. All 3 struck the Wilhelm Gustloff on its port side. The explosions ripped through the ship's hull, causing immediate and catastrophic damage. Panic erupted instantly among the thousands of passengers packed tightly within the ship. The first torpedo hit the bow. The second struck near the empty swimming pool where hundreds of female naval auxiliaries were housed, and the third hit the engine room, cutting all power. The lights went out, plunging the ship into total darkness and chaos. The massive vessel began to list heavily to one side, making it nearly impossible to move through the crowded corridors. People were trampled in the desperate stampede for the upper decks. Many were trapped below, unable to escape the rising, icy water that flooded the lower levels of the ship. The scene was one of unimaginable horror and confusion. Reaching the lifeboats was a desperate struggle. The severe list of the ship made many of them impossible to launch. Some lifeboats capsized as they were lowered, throwing their occupants into the freezing sea. Others were damaged by the initial explosions. The temperature of the Baltic water was just a few degrees above freezing. Anyone who fell into the sea would survive for only a few minutes. The screams of thousands of people filled the night air as the great ship began its final plunge. The Wilhelm Gustloff sank in less than an hour, disappearing beneath the dark waves of the Baltic Sea. The scale of the loss was staggering. Rescue efforts were hampered by the darkness, the extreme cold, and the ongoing threat of submarine attack. While some nearby vessels managed to pull survivors from the water, they could only save a fraction of those on board. Of the estimated 10,500 people on the Wilhelm Gustloff, it is believed that over 9,300 perished. This included more than 5,000 children and teenagers. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff was, and remains, the deadliest maritime disaster in recorded history, a horrific loss of life that dwarfs even the famous sinking of the Titanic. Despite the immense death toll, the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff remains largely unknown to the wider world. There are several reasons for this historical silence. The disaster occurred in the final chaotic months of World War II in Europe. The world was overwhelmed with news of battles, collapsing fronts, and the unfolding horror of the Holocaust. The story of a single sinking, even one so deadly, was lost amid the torrent of catastrophic events. At the time, Germany had little interest in publicizing a devastating military and civilian loss, as it would have been a massive blow to morale. After the war, the world's focus was on the crimes committed by the Nazis. There was little sympathy for German suffering, even civilian suffering. The narrative of the war was one of Allied victory over a brutal regime. A story that portrayed Germans as victims did not fit neatly into this framework. For decades, the tragedy was a taboo subject within Germany itself. It was a painful memory associated with national shame and defeat. As a result, the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff was not taught in schools or widely discussed, leaving it to fade from collective memory for generations. The tragedy serves as a powerful reminder of the devastating human cost of war. It highlights that in any conflict, the lines between combatant and civilian can become tragically blurred. The passengers on the Gustloff were fleeing the horrors of war, only to meet their end in the cold sea. Their story forces us to look beyond simple narratives of good versus evil and confront the brutal reality that war's greatest victims are often the innocent. It underscores the immense suffering that civilians endure when caught between warring powers, a lesson that remains profoundly relevant in conflicts around the world today. Remembering the Wilhelm Gustloff is not about rewriting history or diminishing the responsibility of Nazi Germany for the war. Instead, It is about acknowledging a shared human tragedy. It teaches us the importance of remembering all victims of war and understanding the complex, painful histories that are often hidden in the shadows of major events. The story of the thousands who perished on that cold January night is a somber lesson on the depths of human desperation and the indiscriminate cruelty of conflict. It is a story that deserves to be told, not to assign blame, but to honor the lost and remember the true price of war.